I'm going to go over how to do some modular modeling from this reference. My goal is to make this rectangular building and this circular one. Usually before I start doing any modular modeling, I figure out the pieces that I need to make so I don't make too few or too many. This one is pretty simple. I'm going to break it down into segments that are about the width of this brick. Right here at the top, it's going to be one wall piece that goes straight down. I'll then have a corner piece and modular pieces for this round building. Also going to make windows and these little pillars and a roof piece. I'm going to be ignoring some of the details, the props on it. You can definitely do that, but I'm just going to be doing the base buildings. It can be kind of hard to figure out a scale, especially from pictures like this. There are a few humanoid-looking figures in the scene, so we can tell that it is a pretty large building. But I'm not going for real-world accurate scaling from what this should be. I'm just going to do my best guess to figure out how big it is supposed to be. We're going to get into Maya. Don't need the UV editor yet. Let's get a little bit more screen space. There we go. And I'm going to start off by bringing in the human scale, which you can get to right next to center pivot. We have the content browser. And I'm going to go to bipeds and find the human body. They do come in meters. I am going to scale them down to centimeters, which is 0.01 for X, Y, and Z. I like to keep Maya in centimeters. I find it to be a little bit easier, even though I will be ending up in Unity, which defaults to meters. It is very easy to scale up in Unity. It's one button, and I find that personally I have fewer issues than changing Maya's default scale. So I have my person, and when I'm making walls, especially walls that are one-sided, they're not going to have an interior, they're just going to be exterior. I do like to start with a flat plane and subdivide it one by one. I find it to be a little bit easier, and I can always cut in the geometry that I need. I'm going to move my pivot point by holding down D and V and snapping to a corner, then hold down X to snap that plane to the grid. It is very important that your width of your walls are aligning with the grid. It makes it much easier when you are trying to bring everything together. I'm going to hold down J and rotate it 90 degrees. And this is where I figure out how tall I want my wall to be. You don't really have to snap to the grid. Even though I can't see the grid, it will still snap to 1 unit at a time. And the height doesn't really matter. I still like to snap to the grid just so I have a pretty base, simple shape. But it can really be any height. It does not need to snap going up or down, but left and right is important. And I'm going to make it 2 units across. So here's a very, very simple base for my wall. And if you look at the reference, it is not a straight up and down wall. It is curved, has a slight angle to it. So I'm going to snap it back 1 unit. And then there's a few different ways you could make this top part. There is a little gap in between these large bricks at the very top. I'll be making that in a moment, but for now I'm just going to make a very simple block out and extrude the top of my wall straight up, then back, and then down. So I'm going to extrude it up, and then back, and then down. So very simple blocking out first. I now want to make this base, and I'm going to use the multi-cut, hold down Control, figure out how tall I want that base to be, so about knee height. Go into face mode and extrude out that front. I don't need a left, right, or bottom of that. It's going to be covered up by the ground and the adjoining walls. And I have a pretty decent start. There is this extrusion, this strip going all the way around the building. So I'm going to use the multi-cut, figure out where I want it. You could do a second multi-cut. I always like to bevel edges. It'll split into two, and that way I can interactively see a little bit easier how big or small it's going to be. If you put the edges in and you realize that you want them higher or lower, if you just move them, you're going to probably change the shape of the wall. In the modeling toolkit, we have the transform constraint, which is set to off. If you change that to edge slide, you can very easily slide an edge, and it will not change the shape of the face. Doing two at the same time can work. Sometimes it'll go really slow, but one at a time is good, and make sure you turn off transform constraint when you're done. And for this one, I'm just going to extrude back and then delete the left and the right sides. So we have a pretty good block out. I do want to make this gap between it, and it would be on these three faces up at the very top. If I just extruded out, I would have something that looked pretty close, but I wouldn't have a gap in between these areas. It would just change the shape of the wall. I wouldn't need these side faces, and it wouldn't look quite right. So instead of extruding and moving it, I'm going to extrude and do an offset and scale it inwards a little bit. So I'm building up the geometry that I need. So now I have that border going all the way around it, which will be right here. And with the three large faces selected, I'm going to do an extrusion. And there's two ways you can extrude. If you drag out on the blue arrow, that is your local translate Z, and you can see you'll have a slight angle, and that's because we have three faces that are connected, and it's trying to average out the extrusion. If you don't want that, just click on thickness and drag, and it will be a perfectly straight extrusion. Doesn't really matter which one you choose, and usually when I'm done, regardless, I'll move it around a little bit just to change it up a bit. I'm getting pretty happy with the base of this wall. If we were going really low poly, I might just leave it like this, but I want to add some bevels and a little bit more detail just to make it more interesting. So I'm going to come down to the base, select these edges, and bevel. And I'm going to bring the fraction down a bit and the segments up to 2, just to have a nice rounded look to it. And I'll do the same thing up here. And the top of it is a little bit more complicated, but starting at the very top with these two edges, I'm going to double click on them to get the entire loop. Well, not loop, but the entire edge. And I'll bevel that, figure out how much I want it to be, and then the segments up to 2. And then the perimeter edge. So I'll make sure I get the entire edge going all the way around. I'll bevel that. I generally never bring my bevel fraction all the way to 1. That means somewhere there's going to be a triangle. So, not that one. One of them will be beveled all the way until it stops, and will usually stop to make a triangle. So I might bring it to pretty close to 1, but not all the way. And then segments will be 2. This one, the front left and right corners, will give us some bad geometry when we bevel it, so we will have to clean that up. So if I bevel it and bring that fraction down, and my segments to 2, we can see that we created an n-gon right here and 2 small triangles. There's a lot of ways you could do this to potentially avoid it, but this is actually really easy to clean up. I'm going to select those 2 triangles and delete them, go into vertex mode, and since I snapped everything to the grid, I can select this top vertex, hold down X, and drag it so it stops on the grid. And the same thing for the second one. And now we have one vertex left over that's not doing anything, so I'm just going to delete it. And personal preference, I'm just going to snap this vertex up. So I just held down V, dragged on the up arrow, which is Y, and it snapped to the same location over here. Not really needed, I just prefer to do that. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. You could use the mirror tool if you wanted, but I don't find this takes too long. and I don't like how close together these ones are, so I'm just going to drag them up so they're about halfway. The back needs something similar. It's a little bit less cleanup though. I'm going to round it out. And I don't have any actually bad geometry that was created down here in the corners. However, this is rounded out and it won't fit together perfectly with the adjoining wall. So I'm going to hold down V and drag down so it snaps to that vertex. And then hold down V or X to snap to the grid or to the vertex on the top, just so we have a nice right angle right here. And the same thing on the other side. I'm going to snap it down and then snap it to the right. Finally, I'm going to bevel this inside edge. It should click, when you double click, it should select the entire thing. If it stops somewhere, that probably means you have some geometry that Maya doesn't like. But I'm going to bevel it and do a segments of 2. And then for this one, I am just going to snap that one here and there. And snap that up and across. Now the only things we have to clean up are the front and back faces. These bevels did leave some n-gons. The multi-cut is kind of the way to go. And I'm going to, and when your multi-cut doesn't want to go through something that's pretty simple, it's usually because you have an n-gon. So right here you can see it stops because I have an n-gon, and up here it stops because it gets to the n-gon, but it will get us a pretty good starting point. And I'm just going to then manually finish this edge loop. And I am putting it down the center, so there's only going to be one edge right now. Actually, sorry, I'm just going to undo some of that. I don't need it to go all the way. I really just need it on the top. Sorry. So I'm going to select it. It is going to stop. And I'm going to bevel it. And when you bevel a single edge on a flat surface, it's just going to split into 2 edges. So now I can use the multi-cut and continue straight down. I usually do this in a different order, which is why it kind of threw me off. And I cut left to right first. The order that you fix it in really doesn't matter. It will still get cleaned regardless. And then when I put it down the middle, holding on Control and Shift will snap to 10%, so you can very easily get to 50. And now when I bevel that edge, it will split into 2, and I can move it where I want. And finish cleaning up those n-gons. So right now we have a pretty nice wall. It's relatively high poly, still fairly low, it's 190 faces. You can definitely add in some more edges if needed, if you want to kind of increase some of the disorder on it, if you want to make it look more run down. I'm just going to leave it simple and fairly straight edged everywhere. Since I did extrude this out near the beginning, it's no longer sitting on the grid. The original face right here was further back. So I'm going to move my pivot point to the new front of the wall, then hold down X and snap it back. This is where I like to see, or just to double check to make sure my wall is actually going to fit together, that I didn't mess up somewhere. So I'm going to duplicate it, move it over, and just duplicate it a few times. And I can see that it does line up nicely, and I have a pretty good looking wall. I now need to make a corner piece. So I need to have this nice rounded corner. And for that, I'm going to use the mirror tool. Before I use the mirror tool, I always freeze my transformations, delete my history, and center my pivot. For this kind of mirror, it's really important that your pivot is centered and that you don't have any weird transformations. And there's a good chance the mirror tool with our current wall is not going to work exactly how I want it to, but we will go through. So I'm going to go to Mesh and Mirror, and by default it's going to mirror it across the world. So I just have a second wall over here. I don't want that. I want to mirror across the pivot point, which is centered. So I'm going to change it from world to object. And what I want is to have the exact same looking wall, just with a center edge going down the middle, because it's mirroring the right side to the left. And I always change my merge threshold to 0.01, or it's a really small number, and I'll go over why in a moment. If you rotate it, it's going to start merging together all of the vertices. So you can see how it's merging these center points that are a little bit closer together. That's because it's merging everything that is 1.439 units away. So I just change that to 0.01, so it won't merge them together. And if you hold down J when you are rotating, 0.01, it will snap to 90 degrees. Now I'm rotating in the mirror tool. I'm not actually in the rotate tool. I'm still in the poly mirror tool. However, you can see that my wall looks a little bit weird in the back, and that's because the back is kind of just merging together because there's not enough room. So if you have this issue, I'm just going to hit Z until the mirror goes away. And I'm going to go into vertex mode and select all the vertices on the right, move my pivot point down to a corner, and just drag my wall bigger. It doesn't really matter how big. I'm just going to make it a little bit longer. Then I'm going to center my pivot and freeze my transformations again and do the same mirror. So axis position to object, 0.01 for my merge threshold. If yours still looks wrong, change your axis from X to Z. If you model in a different orientation, that might be the issue. Now holding down J, I'm going to rotate it. So now I have a nice corner piece. It is not aligned to the grid right now. It is kind of a random size. So I'm going to delete my history after I do that mirror. I'm going to move my pivot point down to the front corner, hold down X, and snap it to the grid. So I know that this edge is perfectly on the grid, and this right edge needs to be fixed. So I'm going to go into vertex mode, select all the ones on the right, move my pivot point down to the end. And it is important that you move your pivot point and not keep the pivot point that it gives you, because it will be an average of these inside and outside vertices, so it will not be on the grid. So I'm going to move my pivot down to that corner, hold down X, and if I want it to be 2 units, it's not going to fit. It's going to be too small. So this is going to be a wall that, or a corner piece that is 3 units in both directions. So now it is exactly 3 units by 3 units. Everything is aligning to the grid nicely. I need to round it out. Before I round it out, I'm going to just make a duplicate and hide it, just in case I mess up. I have a backup. And then I'm going to double click on that center edge. It should go all the way down. If it stops somewhere, go into vertex mode and see if you have any floating vertices or anything weird on that center edge from the mirror tool. But if it goes all the way from the top to the bottom, you're good. And I'm going to bevel it and bring my bevel up to just below 1. So you can see here, if I bring it to 1, I have some triangles in the corner. So I'm going to bring it to, for me, 0.99. Get rid of the triangles, and then increase my segments. Personally, I like to have a center edge. Not really required. I just find it's a little bit easier to have a middle. I'm going to go into object mode, move my pivot to a corner, and make sure it lines up with my other wall. And it looks like it is lining up quite nicely. I'm going to do a quick test to make sure things fit together when I snap. So I'm just duplicating and rotating 90 degrees to make sure that it is actually fitting. and it looks like it is fitting together very nicely. Don't have any gaps. However, I do have a hole in my ceiling. Depending on what you're planning on doing with it, you might not need a ceiling. I'm going to be bringing this into Unity. Unity does not render back faces, which does not seem like it's an issue. However, the light, which may be shining from where the camera is pointed right now, will shine through the back face and it won't cast a shadow. You could always make it a double-sided material, but I'm going to make a very simple roof, which I think is a slightly easier solution. And I'm going to have my roof attached to the wall, or part of the roof is going to be attached to the wall. So I'm going to go to where the wall ends, right here. So it should be 3 edges going all the way across. I'm going to extrude, hold down X, and I'm going to snap it, not to the first one, but to the second one. So it goes out to this grid line. So right now my wall is 2 units across and 3 units long. You could mirror this one again to make the roof for the corner piece. I'm going to do the same extrusion that I just did. It's going to look really messy at first. I'm going to select that bottom edge loop. I'm going to extrude. It's going to drag it out until it about just overlaps everything and it looks very bad for the topology. But I'm going to go into vertex mode and select all those vertices and merge them to center, which you can do by going to Edit Mesh and Merge, or Shift right click, Merge Vertices, and then Merge to Center. I'm going to hold down X and then snap this to the grid. Usually I like to model without triangles, however, this corner of the roof is not going to deform, I'm not going to smooth it, so it's not going to really be an issue. I will need one other roof piece, because right now it's going to be a little bit too small, but it should be a very simple roof to make. There we go. So I see I have a little bit of a hole in the center. I'm just going to make a new plane. It'll be a new modular piece. I'm going to make it 1 by 1 and move it, just snap to vertex. Just turn on the wireframe. So I made sure to snap it to the corner piece, not over here. And it is going to be a 2 by 2 flat plane that will fit perfectly up there. It'll look like it's an n-gon, but it's separate geometry. And the nice thing about this being modular is, since the reference image is not a square, it's much bigger, all I have to do is move some of these walls, holding down Shift D to redo that last duplication. And I know the building and the reference is a lot wider than this, but just making sure it works. If I wanted to make it bigger, I would just drag it over this way and maybe make it 3 units across. And then for the roof will look super repetitive. If you ever see it, it's going to be just the same plane, but chances are not actually going to see it. And it's really just there to block light, at least for the version that I am making. And I didn't actually model anything to scale. The inside is a little bit too tall. I'm not overly worried about that. If you realize you did make it a little bit too big, just select those top vertices, and you can move them down, and you can just kind of fix the scale. Or you could select just the back so it doesn't go down quite as much, and bring it up like that. I'm just going to leave it as it is, because I'm going for something that is close to this building, but I don't care if it is perfect. One downside of modular modeling is there's going to be a lot of repetition, because it's going to be the same wall, the same texture, and you might see a seam where these walls line up. You can definitely try to fix that seam when you're texturing. But that's what these pieces, not only do they break up some of the repetition, just make it look more unique, but you can also cover up some seams, which is nice. So I'm going to make a new piece of geometry, just a new square, or a cube. And I'm going to move the pivot point to the back. And just for now, I'm going to snap it just anywhere that is intersecting one of these grid lines, or one of the seams for the walls. I'm going to figure out how big I want this kind of pillar to be, maybe up to there. I'm going to delete the bottom and the back, not going to see them. And you can definitely do something a bit more elaborate than this, but this is going to work. Maybe I'll scale it down a little bit that way. And it's a good way to hide parts of the seams and just make the building look a little bit more interesting. There's a few different places you could put the pivot point for these. Right now it is just kind of random. What I like to do is move the pivot point so it is on one of the intersections for the walls. That makes it pretty easy to place. So I can just hold down V and figure out where I want it to go. It won't always be perfect if you do it this way, since the corner piece is a bit off. You can also have it centered to the grid. And then hold down X and you would be able to place it pretty well. So it just depends on what the piece is and what your building looks like. For these windows, they are rectangular and they're nice rounded on top. So I'm going to make another cube. Just roughly place it where I want it to go. To make it round on top, I'm going to use the multi-cut and put in an edge going all the way down the center. I'm going to bring that center edge up. Select that loop and bevel it, and then increase the segments. Lower this down a little bit. It's not going to be a real window. I don't want to see through it because there's nothing there. So all I'm going to do is extrude, do an offset. You have to be careful when you're doing the offset. If you go too much, you're going to extrude through itself. So I'll just go a little bit, make a nice border for that window, do a second extrusion, and bring it in a little bit. Probably not necessary to bevel it, but I'm going to anyway. And when you bevel the corners like that, you do need to get rid of some n-gons. Yep, there we go. Got a nice little window. Going to isolate, and I'm going to get rid of the back. I'm not going to see it. And just more stuff to UV that I don't really want to. And can always try to make this fit a little bit better just by moving those vertices in so you don't have as much overlap. Save a little bit of room on the UV editor. Go. And then figure out where you want that pivot point to be so you can very easily snap it to anywhere where you need. So for this building, I have one straight wall, a curved wall, a flat plane for a roof, a window, and a pillar. Not that much to make the building. I'm going to delete all the other ones. I know it fits together. I like to have all my modular pieces just kind of lined up off to the side. And put that one just in front. I'm going to UV these. UVing's not so bad for these. There's no back, there's no sides, so it's relatively simple. And I'm going to start off with a camera-based projection. I'm just going to go unfold it immediately just to see kind of what I'm working with. And it would work like this, but it's definitely not perfect. These are all supposed to be rectangular. They're obviously not, and it's a little bit wavy. So I'm going to make some cuts and figure out what to do. Nice thing about UVing is if you don't know where to start cutting, you can always either undo it or sew it back together. So it really doesn't hurt to just start cutting and figure out what you need to do. So I'll just cut that big top part off, and I have this entire bottom piece as one UV shell, and then I'm just going to unfold it. And you can see that got rid of all the distortion on it, so now it's just a rectangle, which is what I want. I'm going to open up the options for my layout and change this to vertical, just to make it a little bit easier and more organized. I'm not worried about the scale right now. And now I need to figure out where I need to cut it up. And I can see there's a lot of blue and some red in these corners, and that's where it's starting to change direction. And down here in the corners as well. Pretty good place to cut is when you have this center edge in your corners. It will not go all the way through your model, depending on how you bevel it, it won't. You can see it has that three-way kind of intersection of edges. If I double click on it, it will go from the outside to that intersection. And if I cut it, and then go to the other side and cut, I hit G to repeat the last command. And then do the same thing up here. And if I unfold now, you can see that it is kind of relieving a lot of the pressure that was causing that stretching and compression. It's still not perfect. These are still not rectangular, but it's a little bit better. And a big part of the issue are these tabs on the left and right. It's trying to unfold it down flat, and these are just stopping it from unfolding properly. So I'm just going to cut them off entirely. I'm going to double click on that edge, cut, and go to the other side, double click and cut, and unfold. And you can see how different these UV shells unfold now. And now when I unfold this, it'll be much, much better. Oops. There we go. So now it's looking really nice, very simple UVs. I'm going to give everything a layout. You definitely could sew these together to have one large UV shell. However, if you do that, you will have bonus, you won't have a seam right there. But if I do a layout, you can see how much smaller everything got, because the layout will scale everything to be an equal textile density. And the bigger the UV shell you have, the more it has to shrink down, and the more everything else has to shrink down as well. So if there's a place where you won't notice a cut, or you think it won't be an issue, I like to cut it so I have two UV shells. So I'm going to do a layout. They will scale up, and I'll just have a nicer textile density overall. And I'm just going to leave these as they are. You definitely could cut them up a bit so they don't really unfold better. Oops. They'll change a little bit. You could have them so they are straight. It would make the texture look a little bit nicer, and they'll fit a little bit better on the UV editor. But it's a lot more cuts. It's up to you if you want to do that. So it could look like that, and it is just easier to fit on the UV editor than this weird shape. But I'm just going to leave them sewn together and just have fewer cuts. This one looks like it would be a lot more complicated, but it's the exact same cuts that we have to make. So I'm going to do a camera-based. Then I'm going to reopen Maya and hope that it has a crash save. Alright, so there is a crash save, which is awesome. And it has a recovered. I'm going to click on it. And it looks like I didn't really lose any progress. So let me just move this back to where OBS is looking. Good enough. So here it is. I might as well do a save just in case the next time it crashes it doesn't do that. There we go. What I was trying to do was unfold. There we go. And I need to make the exact same cuts I did on the other one. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to cut off where that big brick is. Going to unfold. It won't be perfectly straight because it is a curved wall. There are different ways you can use straighten UVs to make it straight. You get a little bit more distortion. I'm going to leave it like this and see how Painter takes it. Hopefully it'll be fine. And then up here, I'm going to double click on those center edges. And I know they have to be cut off completely, so I'll just go through here and cut them off. Unfold, unfold, and unfold. And it's looking pretty good. So do a layout for all of them. Need to bring that back to vertical. So it's looking pretty nice. Definitely needs to have a little bit of a manual layout to make it better. This piece. Fix. So the cool thing about this one is it was a cube. I only beveled it and got rid of a few edges, so all I had to do was unfold it. If that doesn't work for you, just go to camera based and unfold, and then you have that same center edge that you can double click, cut, and then unfold. This window, a little bit more complicated because deleted some stuff and did some extrusions. So camera based and unfold. And again, it has a nice center edge that stops at that three-way intersection of edges. And same thing down here. And this one doesn't actually have to be UV, it's just a flat plane. If for some reason it's not proper, this is one of the only times where automatic mapping is really good, because it's a flat plane and can't really mess it up. Now with all of these pieces, I'm going to do a layout. I'm going to leave it like this for now, because there's more pieces that I need to make, but it's looking pretty good. The other building is round, which does look harder to do, but there's some cool ways to make this pretty easily. I'm going to do a save and go back to my modeling toolkit, or my modeling workspace, and I'm going to make a cylinder. I'm going to move the pivot point to the bottom and just scale it up to be roughly the size that I want it to be. And it is going to get taller and have a roof, so I'm just judging from the base up to here. It does flare out on the bottom, so let's take that and scale those vertices out. I'm going to delete the bottom as well, and then extrude straight down. On the top, it flares out, then goes up, in, then up with a diagonal, then rounds, and then goes down to have a little platform. And this is probably way too tall, so let me just fix some of the scale right now. That looks a little better. You can always change it later if needed. This is more for going through the process, not getting exact like the reference. So I'm going to give an offset, then extrude up, and then extrude in, and then extrude up again, and scale it inwards. Do another extrude with an offset, and then bring it down. So we've got a really, really rough version of what this building should look like. It should definitely be a lot wider and shorter. So that's a little bit better. It does have these big kind of bricks at the bottom, those big indentations. I'm going to say it's about 2 of these across. You could definitely try to count and figure out how many should be in a 360. I'm just going to say there's 2 right here, and that's close enough. I'm going to select them, give them an offset, then extrude them again, bring them in, and I'll give it a little bit of a bevel just to make it look nicer. Actually, I'm going to undo that so I can do 1 bevel first. I do want to have a bevel going around this way. This makes it a little bit nicer. And 1 at the bottom. So now I'm going to do that exact same thing. Extrude with an offset. Bring it in. And bevel. And that's going to bevel out all of these other edges going around it. So I'm double clicking to get the entire loop. And you might be wondering why we're making this in one big chunk. It's definitely not modular. It will be modular soon. There we are. So it's looking pretty good. It's what I want it to be. However, I don't want to make this extrusion everywhere, and it needs to be a modular piece. So I'm going to select all the faces that make up this little segment, then make sure I get the sides over here. And I'm going to invert my selection by holding down Shift and dragging a box around the entire model. I'll insert my selection and I can delete it. And now I'm left with a segment of that building, which if I duplicate it and rotate it 36 degrees, I can then rebuild the building, and it is a very simple way of making a round building. It will have a little bit of a hard edge here. Usually you can hide that pretty well with texturing, or it won't be overly noticeable when you're rendering. And UVing this is quite simple. You go to UV editing, camera based, and unfold, and it's kind of good enough just like that. If it's too long, you can definitely cut it. I would recommend cutting somewhere you probably won't see, so maybe just cutting that piece off of the roof. But I'm going to leave it as one big chunk. And you can see that scaled together, this UV shell is a lot bigger than everything else. So this is the correct textile density of it. Let's just double check. Yep. So I might cut this one up a little bit. Maybe cut it there. So now everything will be able to get a little bit bigger. And that's filling the UV space a lot better. I'm not overly fond of UV shells at these weird angles and whatnot, so I'm not going to do it now because it's very boring to watch, but go through and give it a little bit more of an organized look. It does make it a lot easier if you have UV shells that are straight up and down. It will look a little bit better in Painter or whatever texturing software you're using. Obviously, it won't all be able to be completely vertical or horizontal, but can do your best to make things fit nicely and just be a little bit more organized than a default layout.